Hello, welcome to episode 167 of the Book Binge, where this week we're talking a little bit more of a controversial title. I think we all know the backstory of the novel titled Rage, written under the name of Richard Bachman. Over time, Stephen King decided he didn't really like the book that much and didn't like what it represented. But is it really as simple as that? I wanted to make this review not just to review the book, because I review all the books that I read at this point, but because I think that the discussion is a little bit more complicated than most other books will say, even most other controversial titles, where, like, you could do the whole separate art from artist type of thing. This one's a little bit more personal for certain people. This one's a little bit more generally controversial to life these days in America, we'll say. Anyway, that's what I am here to discuss, but I do want to start off just like normal with the good. I don't think Rage is a bad book personally. I've always considered it to be underrated, so I do think that there are some things that could be and really should be praised about the book. First off, I think that the thematic work is surprisingly nuanced. Despite the way that people tend to represent the book, it is genuinely pretty good on the thematic level. It explores humanity, and especially the dingier parts of it, the dirtier parts of what living is like. It explores what environmental factors can do to a mind, the way that people can be warped and shifted by where they live, how they grow up, that kind of thing. It explores the way in which somebody experiences a childhood can influence their psychology. The psychological aspects of the story are really well done, all things considered. For what they are shockingly good. The general character work as well is surprisingly good, even beyond their thematic value, because they do have a lot of thematic value, these characters do, in depicting and representing those kind of thematic elements of the story. But exploring how characters can stress or side with different things given a scenario, things that maybe they wouldn't normally do or say, things that maybe they normally wouldn't think, the ways that certain people cope with being in a dangerous or an unfortunate circumstance, the way that people can change the way they interact with the dangers in their life, whether those be human or not, and the way in which a person who is being a danger might influence the way that others are thinking, just kind of as an external factor. Exploring how people work with what they're given to do weird things sometimes, behaving differently, speaking differently, generally just the way that, like I said, stress and stuff can affect how a person acts. Weird things that still feel normal in certain regards, despite how they sometimes feel off just because of the situation being so abnormal. It's really hard to explain, but I genuinely do think most of the character work in the story is well done, and I also think that the plot and setting is pretty good, even if it comes off as a bit too real. They provide a great background for the thematic exploration that King is making here because of how, in some sense, real they are. It is a darker side of what we think of as normal life, quote unquote normal life, but I do think it is a good background for painting the thematic and character portraits that King does because of how real they are. It gives you a little bit of a more strong idea of how certain things can affect people because they do seem a little bit real. On the topic of the bad of Rage, certain times dialogue and certain references feel a little bit weird for high schoolers in this kind of situation. And I know, like, some of this feels a little bit weird because the book's, 50 years old or something like that at this point. It's quite an old book. Maybe not quite 50 years old, but it's almost that old. It is an old book. It is definitely of its time as far as certain references are concerned. And even though King's characters and dialogue are generally very good, in this one there are moments where things just come off as a little bit strange. The character work generally, I say, is good, but sometimes the dialogue and interactions feel a little bit off. The sort of factions that are formed between characters as well sometimes seem a little bit wrong and come off a little bit bad in some regards, perhaps on account of unreliable narration, which is also, an aspect of the story that is actually good. Some of the things that do feel bad or off, or that maybe are a little bit questionable, could be blamed on an unreliable narration aspect. Also, one of the main complaints that this book has, one of the things that it is often given the most ire for, and, generally well so, is the supposed idealization of the school shooter through being in his mind. But I think that's only really a problem if you see it that way. If you see it more on the topic of the thematic values that King is trying to portray, or rather not portray, but trying to, poke through the portrayal of this character, you actually see a much different story. This book could be taken two completely different ways depending on what side of the spectrum you fall on, and depending on how your preconceived notions affect your reading. Certain scenes may feel a little bit bloated and unneeded in the context of the story and are, a little bit a couple are kind of gross and kind of unnecessary. As such, the last third of the book feels really exhausting through some of these unnecessary or bloated scenes, even despite the book being so short. But I also think this kind of reflects Charlie's growing exhaustion as the story goes on as well, so maybe some of that is intentional too. I don't know, but it is something to keep in mind. The last third of the book is a little bit exhausting to push through if you're trying to binge read this, as I ended up doing over the course of just a couple days. But like I said, generally the preconceived notions are going to make the biggest influence on how well you personally enjoy this book or not. A lot of it comes down to whether you want it to come off as an idealization of this terrible thing, or if you want to see what is being said about humanity and what can drive a person to do something so terrible. And on that note, I do have to give a spoiler warning for this. I am going to discuss spoilers throughout the entirety of the section called The Ugly. So if you care about spoilers for Rage, you can skip until the recommendation and avoid some of the spoilers. I don't typically do spoiler sections in my videos unless they really affect me emotionally, but in order to discuss some of these aspects a little bit more in depth, I kind of have to go into certain spoiler ranges. It's not going to be super spoilery. It's not going to, go plot beat by plot beat or anything like that, but it is, something to be aware of. If you don't want any spoilers for this, if you're one of those people, skip until the recommendation. So, if you're gone now, what gives about the school shooter side of the story? I know this is a sensitive topic and one to be taken seriously, so I'm not trying to make light of anything. And I spoke earlier of the idealization aspect, and I don't think this is the full story. The main thing that most people complain about when it comes to this aspect of the book is the supposed, as I put it earlier, idealization of the school shooter and being in his mind. The protagonist kind of comes off at times, multiple times in the book, based off of his monologuing and the way that he talks to the other students, as attempting to garner, apologies from people for making him do what he did, or to make people feel bad for his home life, his father, the way his father treated him, and some of these external factors that, he's trying to excuse himself for becoming the way that he is, for doing this thing because of it. But I think to a degree you have to understand that this is how certain people, certain personalities, when given certain environmental factors, different things can combine in just the wrong ways to make somebody snap. Again, in just the wrong way. This is a very real thing. What happens when people get pushed to the edge is usually quite ugly, and this is just one way in which that kind of thing manifests. It's, again, a little bit more real of a topic than we would like for it to be these days, but I do think it is important to recognize these kinds of things. Charlie Decker, as the main character, holds up a classroom and forces some odd interactions between some of the other students. This can also be another aspect that just feels genuinely ugly and gross, and that's because it is. Charlie, I don't think, ever denies the wrongness in what he's doing. He may try to justify it in certain ways, the same way that somebody put in this situation, or somebody who chooses to go along this path, somebody who just, sits and wallows in their self-pity and misery, who takes this kind of a dark path in real life. This is the kind of thing that some of them might be able to do, is justify horrible actions because of other people. But in the situation in the book, at the very least, Charlie doesn't deny that what he's doing is wrong. He says in his monologuing at a couple points that maybe he shouldn't have done this, or he kind of second guesses the point of what he was trying to do, but going the whole, well, it's too late to turn back now kind of thing. The way that certain people, I actually think that there are certain people who have done very bad things in their life who have questioned it in the middle of it, kind of the same way that people who try to end life for themselves, sometimes by jumping off of a high bridge or something like that. Some of those people have, well, at least the ones who have survived doing something of that sort, have always mentioned the idea of regretting it as soon as they do it. So like there's some of this in there. Like I said, the story is a little bit more nuanced than I think people give it credit for. Charlie Decker is a little bit more complex of a character than I think he's made out to be, just as the general reputation of the book might show. Part of the unreliability of the narration kind of makes some of these uglier aspects come off as a little bit uglier than I think they might, because like I said, this first person narration may make some of these ugly things feel, it makes Charlie seem as if he's justifying it, and this kind of goes into that narrative of idealizing this character, and I don't think that's what's happening. I think that's just King being in the mind, or writing from the mind of somebody in that situation. Like I said, dialogue in Charlie's monologuing go over some weird and kind of gross places sometimes too, as I briefly mentioned in The Bad. But again, this is no different or worse than a ton of other books that people have written in the past. One cannot attribute writing about something to condoning it. Those are not the same thing. King is not responsible for school shooters any more than Slipknot is responsible for some murderers back in 1999 or 2000 or whenever that case happened. I know King personally chose to take Rage off of the market. That is his decision. I respect his decision. But I think he might have also been pressured to do so to some degree by, society, because of those things. It's the same way that, like I said, Slipknot, as an example, back in 1999 or 2000, were attempted to be canceled, or the equivalent at the time, because of a couple of murderers who, attributed some of their acts with lyrics from one Slipknot song. Slipknot's not responsible for those murderers. King isn't responsible for the actions of people who take the story in the wrong direction. Again, like I said, there are far weirder, crazier, grosser, arguably more problematic things in other books, including some of his other books that have never been cut later or taken off the market. Doing so to this one just kind of feels weird to me. Like, I understand why he did it, and I respect that decision, but it is, the book is a lot more nuanced and a lot more complex than the fact that it was taken off the market just tends to depict on its own. Again, King is not responsible for what crazy people do, so I think exploring the dingy parts of psychology on people for whom this kind of thing is real is actually enlightening more than anything, in my personal mind. This is also, brought forth by the fact that, I kind of relate into certain aspects of what Charlie talks about in what is depicted in the book, and I know some other people who have come to a much healthier place because of seeing what the depiction of Charlie's character and what he does, the negative reaction of that, seeing what the depiction of releasing those things poorly and how bad that can be for other people. Pretending the ugly doesn't exist doesn't allow us to combat it. Writing this story has allowed certain people to come out of negative mindsets because they realize that, that's actually bad. If I went down that route, that would be a bad thing. I need to get out of that. It has inspired certain people to get out of that. And I could say that maybe a little bit of the same could be said for me. I never was going down that dark of a path. I never would have considered anything like that. I hate being in trouble, and doing that kind of thing would put me in the most trouble, so I never would do that kind of thing. But as far as bullying or bad relationships with people close to you can influence the way that a mind works, influence the way that a person thinks, and put them in a negative headspace that would make them do things that they wouldn't if they weren't in that headspace, is something that I do think should be depicted on the page. And while Rage may be a little bit too real to some people, I don't think it's a bad thing that the book exists. To me, Rage is a surprisingly clean and brilliant depiction of what was covered as a school shooting story. And this brings me to the recommendation and kind of wrapping some of these things up. I read Rage for the first time in 2020. 2019 through early 2020 was arguably the darkest time in my personal life, and as I mentioned a little bit before, I related to certain aspects of the book then and considered it heavily underrated in the way that King handled them. I reread the book just now in April 2024, reading it for the second time. Though I didn't relate to any of that stuff as actively anymore, I remember being able to relate to certain aspects of the negative mindset, we'll say, and still consider it heavily underrated as such, or maybe if it's not underrated, at the very least it is overly maligned. I think there are too many people who just, recognize the fact that this book was taken off the market, that King doesn't like this book, and kind of ran with that in a way of oh, this book is actually just really bad, or it glorifies this thing, when it doesn't actually. I don't think it actually does. Rage is not a bad book. As long as you can handle the subject matter and go in without preconceived notions, or rather without those preconceived notions, forcing you to dislike it for some reason, I do recommend reading it for the surprisingly subtle character and thematic work on display. It's by no means the best book in the world. It is by no means an absolutely brilliant book. It is by no means amazing, but it is not bad. And I think that calling it bad is selling it short, because it does handle character, it does handle psychology, it does handle themes in a surprisingly well written and nuanced way. So my recommendation is avoid it if you want to avoid it. Avoid it if this kind of thing is a little bit too close to you. Avoid it if you don't really feel like reading it. It's not one that I want people to go out and read, especially since it is so hard to, relatively difficult to get a copy of a book with it, one of these Bachman book collections. If you want to get an actual copy of Rage just as it is, that'd be even harder to get. But it is a book that I think is overly maligned, underrated, is one that I think more people should read. But you have to understand the circumstances going in and know that simply going in with the idea that, oh, it's a bad book because King took it off the market, or it glorifies really bad things, when that's not the truth. I think if you go in with blank expectations, you go in just seeing what it does, you might enjoy it a little bit more. Kind of like I did when I first read it, because I didn't know what it was about when I first read it. So, that's just kind of how things go. Either way, that is the end of my review of Rage. If you are one of the other people who has read it, let me know what you thought in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll be back, I don't even know when, and I don't even know with what video. Next week will be a review of The Murdered Son by Christopher Rocchio, actually. That's apparently what I have on my schedule, so if you're excited for that, if you're a big Sun Eater fan, as probably a good chunk of my viewers are, Sun Eater is by far the most popular content on my channel, by an extreme margin. If you're excited for that, I hope you check that video out when it comes out next week. Thank you for watching. I'll be back in the next video regardless.